So, as I was saying, I'm Barry Saiff. This is our webinar about technical writing outsourcing in agile environments. And we're going to get started now. And I just want to say welcome. Thanks for joining us. Okay. So, a brief look at our agenda. We're going to introduce myself and the two panelists that we have on the webinar. And we're going to show you the questions that we sent you about 10 minutes ago in email, which you can answer in the chat window, just to learn a little bit about who's on the line with us and what your experience is. We'll talk about technical writing outsourcing, some of the myths about it, what it looks like when it succeeds, what the key success factors are, some of the risks. And then we're going to discuss where do technical writers fit in an agile environment. And that's where our two panelists are going to start helping us out. And we'll discuss a case study about technical writing outsourcing in an agile environment. And we'll have, hopefully we'll have about half of the time available for questions and comments. So please think about what questions you want to ask or what you want to discuss. And at the end of the webinar, I'll explain how you can get a 70% off discount on your LavaCon Las Vegas registration. Okay, so I'm Barry Saiff. I've been in technical writing for several decades. I led teams of writers at a bunch of companies in the US, Oracle, Symantec, most recently. But then about 5 years ago, I started Saiff Solutions, which is a technical writing outsourcing company in the Philippines. We're in Tagaytay City, Philippines, and we have several very large customers in Japan and the United States. And we have now a full-time staff here in the Philippines of 12 people and a bunch of part-timers here and elsewhere. So that's me. And let's see. Fred, why don't you unmute yourself and show your webcam and introduce yourself.
Hi there, I'm Fred Williams. I've been working with Barry for about a year now in a training and consulting role. I'm actually coming to you today from Prague in the Czech Republic, where I am the founder of Williams Technical. What we do is we teach people how to work within the agile development environment with a focus on writing requirements and user stories and defining user goals. In addition, I've been teaching and certifying technical writers for the last decade. And if you type technical writing course into Google, you'll still see the Wikiversity course that I put online for free many years ago. Nowadays, I also speak at a lot of conferences, particularly about agile development methodologies, defining user stories, test cases, and how do you actually work in a multicultural environment across many different time zones and still keep the sprints going with integrated team members. So I'm not going to talk very much today because I'm mostly interested in the conversation at the end of this. And next up is our colleague Gaile. I'm going to mute and hide myself again. Thank you.
Okay, Gaile.
Thank you, Fred. Hi, my name is Gaile. I am a technical writer, and I have been at Saiff Solutions for more than 2 years. I have worked for different clients and have learned different tools such as FrameMaker, DocZone, and Madcap Flare. I am pleased with my job because I learn a lot and I'm able to meet different people from different locations. I consider technical writing a rewarding job because I know that I help people to understand the service and the product that they are using. Thank you.
Thanks, Gaile. Okay, so I'm just going to show these questions for a brief period. You all have them in your email, and you're welcome to type your answers. They're all yes, no, not applicable. So what you can do is just type like 1-Y, 2-, and however that works for you. And we go. Okay. So let's talk about myths about technical writing outsourcing. So where you see this capital TWO, that is my abbreviation for technical writing outsourcing. So do you believe any of these? Technical writing outsourcing results in low quality. It certainly can, but doesn't have to. The same with the next one. Always leads to layoffs. Actually, in the last 4 years that we've been operating at Saiff Solutions, we have so far never been involved in an engagement where people were laid off before, during, or after our involvement. Now, I've actually been involved in layoffs before I started this company, and I know that they happen as a result of outsourcing, but obviously they don't always happen. So another myth is that whether or not outsourcing occurs is up to me. In other words, if I just try to prevent it, it's not going to happen. Well, unfortunately, there are powerful historical forces that lead to outsourcing. Basically, over centuries, you can see that productivity goes up, and changes that increase productivity are kind of hard to stop. There's a lot of pressure on companies to save costs, and the best approach is to do what everyone here is doing, learn about outsourcing so we can be prepared for it and try to have it work well. And then this is kind of a generic myth. All tech writing outsourcing situations lead to problems. Well, it's kind of like saying all corporations are bad. It is such a diverse and broad phenomena. It really is like talking about business, and to say, well, business results in exploitation of people. Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Same thing with almost anything you could say about outsourcing. So what happens when technical writing outsourcing works well? You have effective global collaboration. You have people learning a lot more, in particular learning from working with different folks in different locations and cultures and languages. Process improvement, often what precedes an outsourcing situation is a real careful look at the process so you can break it down and figure out, okay, which pieces are we going to move over here, which are we going to keep there, and that whole process can lead to quality improvements. Improved quality can result reduced costs. A word about the reduced costs: just because the pay scales may be 20% in one country of what they are in another doesn't mean you're going to save 80%. There's a lot of additional costs with outsourcing. There's more training, more travel. There's increased management costs, but you can save money, and figures I've seen is maybe 10 to 25%. If you manage it well, that's a good savings to achieve. Yeah, certainly if you've got customers around the world, it is more effective to have creators of your software, of your documentation around the world as well. And the other thing that's not mentioned there, I'm sorry, is improve morale. So if you have a group of highly experienced tech writers, say in the United States, and they end up doing everything, including a lot of lower level tasks they're not too excited about, and then you add some other writers in another location, another company, and they are less experienced and can take on some of those lower level tasks, it actually can improve the morale of the original team, and I've actually seen that happen and been a part of that. So the key success factors for technical writing outsourcing: you want to choose the country that you're working with carefully. It's surprising to many people that the Philippines has been rated consistently the #1 country in business English, even ahead of the US and the UK. Now that's business English. I mean, if you go talk to the man on the street in some province in the Philippines, their English may not be that good, but English is the language of business in the Philippines. You want to be careful about choosing your provider, making sure it's a good match, that's a good company, that they train their people well. You want to consider the process maturity of your organization, and this is where Agile can help, because if you've already adopted Agile or you're starting to adopt it, clearly you're thinking about process and how to improve it. If your process is really difficult, outsourcing can magnify those problems. So for example, if the writers are in the same building on the same floor as the developers and they still can't find out about the UI changes in an organized manner and find out at the last minute when it's too late, well, you need to fix that problem before you kind of add outsourcing into the mix. And many people start with a small project and see how that works before they launch into a big outsourcing project. So there are risks involved in outsourcing. There are pitfalls, and these are some of them. And it's so location is one thing. It also can be function. For example, if you have a company that doesn't have any tech writers, never had any tech writers, and now you add some tech writers in another country, another company, the problem may not be that you're outsourcing. The problem may be that these engineers don't know how to work with tech writers. So it could be function or role as well as location. It could be inclusion. So, for example, the tech writers that are in the same location, the same country, same city are participating in all the conference calls, all the wikis or intranets, they're all on the email lists, and then you add writers in another country and they don't get to participate in any of that. Well, it's not surprising they're not going to do a good job because they're not being included and they don't have the access they need. Language can certainly cause problems, and one of the things that's important with this is editing. If you have writers involved whose first language is not English, it makes it even more important that you do have editing. You need quality control. Experience level sometimes is hidden behind location factors. So you can have a writer with 25 years experience working in the US and someone in India or the Philippines with 1 year experience. You can't expect the same thing of someone with 1 year experience that you'd expect of someone with 25. Culture is something that if you don't understand it well is likely to cause problems. You really need to get to know people and understand the strengths and weaknesses of your own culture and the other cultures you're working with. Understand how people communicate and how they make decisions, how they deal with conflict. One key thing is in a culture like many Asian cultures, for instance in the Philippines, people are typically reluctant to say no. And if people don't want to say no, that means that the word yes can have many meanings. So you need to watch out for that. And of course, you have more and less competent writers in every location. And management is key. In general, when things go wrong, it's because they weren't managed properly, particularly with outsourcing situations. And one of the key reasons to learn about outsourcing as a technical communicator is so that you can be involved when these outsourcing decisions are made, because decisions that do not involve technical communicators are more likely to be abrupt and to cause a lot of problems. So let's talk about how combining technical writing, outsourcing, and Agile can help you. So if you have more work than writers, perhaps because you just adopted Agile and now there's more demand, outsourcing can enable you to expand your team at a lower cost. If some of your development, QA, or other functions has moved overseas, then outsourcing can enable you to have writers in the same time zone or a closer time zone to where those folks are now located. If your scarce resources is management time, training time, so that maybe you could hire people locally, but you just don't have time to train them and manage them, well, bringing on the right outsourcing company can really address that issue. And then if you're already using technical writing outsourcing, but your processes are not inadequate to support, or not adequate to support distributed teams, well, that's where Agile can help. And bringing in Agile and combining outsourcing of tech writing can really make a difference. So, in the questions, maybe you can, when you get to the question section, you can suggest other situations that, other ways that combining tech writing and outsourcing and Agile can help, or ways that it might cause problems. So I'm going to pass the baton now to Fred. And Fred, why don't you unmute yourself and show your webcam and talk about roles and responsibilities in Agile.
Hi there. So I'm assuming everybody can hear me now. I'm going to talk about the timing of sprints and delivery of documentation in an Agile environment, where technical writers' place is when you look at the Scrum diagram in front of us, and for that matter, where QA is, and talk about ways that we can test the quality of the user stories in an Agile sprint to make sure that we're actually supporting the documentation effort properly. So the first thing that you'll notice in doing documentation in a sprint, in a Agile environment, is that a lot of teams will end up having the documentation being delivered one sprint behind. And this is frequently because it turns out that the developers actually finalize the user interface at the last minute. So this is not an uncommon problem. And if you're in that situation, we can talk about ways to improve the situation so that you can come into synchronization with the deliveries so that documentation and development are delivered in the same sprint. Because what really matters here, and often the reason why documentation is one sprint behind, is because if you look at this diagram, it's a very classical, standard description of the roles and communication flows within a Scrum environment, which is just one way of doing Agile. But if you look at this, you don't see any QA, and you don't see any technical writers. Now, whether this is an accidental omission or because the people who are behind the Scrum methodology believe that teams should be multifunctional and therefore the technical writers are automatically assumed to be members of the team, or that developers are assumed to be both performing their own QA and performing their own documentation. Whether that's the case or whether they just didn't think about including the technical writers in QA, it's an important conversation to have, because if you're really going to be in an Agile environment, if the testers and technical writers are not part of the team, obviously you're going to have problems with synchronization, with communication, and of course with quality. So the final thing I want to mention, and again, I'm going to speak very quickly today so that we have more time in the conversation afterwards. But the final thing I want to talk about is the quality of the user stories. Are the user stories actually describing human behavior? Or are developers perhaps trying to force what are really non-negotiable requirements or back-end technical descriptions, and then artificially forcing them into a user story mold? How do you actually track the user stories and test them? How do you ensure that a technical writer could actually write perhaps 50% or more of the documentation even before the development starts, just based on high-quality user stories? So this is another aspect of how you can make documentation work well with Agile. If you have low-quality user stories, if you've got confusing vision, if it's unclear exactly who you're making this product for, when they're going to use it, where they're going to use it, why they're going to use it, if those questions are unanswered, then a technical writer can actually help by injecting those questions into the conversation early and helping the product owner come up with those answers, which benefits the entire team. Without this information, you're not really Agile. So this is something where a technical writer could either be alienated from the team and not have that information because of poor user stories, or the technical writer, as a full member of the team, like Gaile, can actually provide feedback during the development process and improve the situation for everyone. Additionally, helping by doing some of the user testing to take some of the load off of the QA. Because oftentimes QA and technical writers, as you know, work in partnership. So all of these are things to discuss when we're talking about how to make agile technical writing work, especially in an outsourced environment. We can also talk about your methodology of communication, whether you're using web cameras, whether technical writers are part of the daily stand-ups, sprint planning, retrospectives, and so on. So I'm looking forward to your conversations and comments, and I'm going to pass it along to Gaile now.
Thanks, Fred. Can you? Okay. So, hi everyone, I'm back. I work with Dave. Dave is the technical writing manager and is also my Scrum Master. I am here in the Philippines and Dave is in Colorado. Dave and I meet twice a week at 11 a.m. my time. We communicate through emails and live chats. Dave is an excellent technical writing manager and is strict when it comes to deadlines. So during our Scrum meeting, Dave sees to it that all issues are resolved and tasks are explained well. We have sprint planning meetings, and that is the time when we plan what to achieve during the sprint. So I start off by reading and researching about the product and its features, and then after that, I create a topic structure. Then I start writing drafts. After writing the draft, I turn it over to our editor who is in India. After the revision, I submit the draft to Dave for peer review. So that's the story.
Very good. Thanks, Gaile.
You're welcome.
Okay. So we have a case study that we'd like to consider. And here's the background. So the developers started developing before the tech writers got involved. And so now we have to figure out how do we fit into that process. Because the tech writers can't work on the same things on the same schedule. So how can the writers best participate? Should they skip documenting the portions already developed and jump into the team sprint schedule, or devise their own sprint schedule, matching the team and dates but different content, or another approach? So what do you as the documentation manager do? And I'm going to go ahead and unmute everyone so that you can jump in and discuss with us. Okay. So you can either type something in chat or you can speak up. We'd like to hear.
Go first, Barry.
Yeah, go ahead, Fred. Yeah.
But I've confronted this scenario in the past, both as a technical writer and as a manager. The response I usually get from my own bosses would be, well, you don't get an either or, do both. We want you to simultaneously document what already exists and be working on the new stuff. And I'm curious if anybody out there who's listening on this has a similar experience.
Yes. That's pretty much what I wrote. We typically play catch up while getting involved with the upcoming work.
That's great. Could you say your name?
This is Martha.
Martha, great, thanks.
Hi, Martha. So how does that work out in practice? Do you have a backlog of existing functionality that you're going through, and also a separate backlog for new functionality, and then just alternate or try to do them both simultaneously? Do you assign different writers to different aspects?
Well, first you got to prioritize what's the most important, what has to be done first. And sometimes that is getting the backlog done because it was at a customer request. So get that documentation done so that they have something to hand over for a field test. And sometimes the priority is get involved with what's coming up right now because that is also a customer need and that has higher priority than catching up with what's done. So it's based on what the priority is, and the customer should be driving that.
And Martha, may I ask you, do you have a team of writers, or are you all alone, or how does it work with your company?
I have a small team. We recently lost some of our team members to outsourcing, and we did not get to incorporate the outsourced writers into actual teamwork. They were moved to separate projects. So it's a small team. Prioritization is our lifeblood.
Great.
And we're kind of in crisis mode all the time.
So do you have the authority yourself to actually get extra help on a temporary basis, perhaps from somebody in an outsourcing environment, where someone could come in and say, okay, for the next 3 sprints, we're going to have extra help to work through our deadlines? Do you have that authority to make that decision?
I do not. I have raised the possibility, and we are getting some visibility to it, but it doesn't fix the immediate scenarios.
Yeah, documentation is always the last item on the list when it comes to budgets, huh?
Pretty much. That and training.
Exactly. So how are you solving the problems now? You say you're in a little bit of a crisis mode at the moment.
Well, the crisis is we have a doc delivery in 6 weeks, and we are playing catch up as well as working with Sprint. The good thing for us is that our Sprint cycle includes a hardening period in which no new feature work is developed, and we're hitting that this week, so we have some catch-up time built into the schedule.
That's great, yeah.
That sounds reasonable. Well, let me ask if anybody else has a similar situation like Martha and what we were describing here in the case study, where you've got both existing functionality that still requires documentation, plus you're required to keep up with the sprint schedules. Does anybody else have that situation?
There's one more person who answered in the question box and said, never skip the documentation. Right, so never skip documenting something, which certainly makes sense, yes.
Well, maybe we should move on to the questions you sent earlier, Barry, and have a bit of conversation about that.
Okay, let's see. If we go, I can go back to those, yeah. Here we go. So, well, it sounds like we do have folks with experience in both working in an agile development environment and working with outsourced writers. And, oh, let's see, show answered questions. Yeah, I've got a bunch of answers here. So, right. All right, so one person is, let's see, yes for 1, yes for 2, yes for 3, no for 4 and 5, yes for 6, yes for 7, no for 8. And then another person says, here we go, 1 yes, 2 yes, 3 no, 4 no, 5 no, 6 no, 7 yes, 8 yes. And then someone else says 1 yes, 2 no, 3 no, 4 not applicable, 5 NA, 6 no, 7 no, 8 yes. And for 9, we try to do tech writing 1 to 2 sprints ahead of development. Well, that's good.
Yeah, whoever wrote that, could you tell us a little bit about your strategies for getting ahead of development?
David? Let's see, maybe he will, I think he's typing. Maybe he can't speak here. Let's see. Okay. Yes, my apologies for not having a mic. This is David, and he's going to, so we have 3 tech writers, one assigned to the BPA team, one assigned to regular doc, and one for closeout. And I'm not sure what you mean by closeout, Dave. Let's see, I think it's going to type more. We're getting ready to close out our project in the next 6 weeks. I see. So one writer, I see. So it's kind of by dividing up how the writers work. Yeah. Correct. I see. Okay. And then we have another answer. Yeah, so Mike McGraw says a strategy of documenting earlier and latest features seems like a Swiss cheese approach. There'll be a lot of holes. Potentially, yeah.
Well, that's an excellent point, and this is why Martha's point about prioritizing, so that even if it is Swiss cheese, at least the cheesy parts are important and the holes are, at least according to your analysis, less important. But ideally, of course, we want to document everything, but that rarely happens in the real world where we document 100% of everything. So like always, there's a balancing act. And this is where outsourced technical writing could actually be a big help, because you could look at the holes in the content, especially for existing functionality, and providing that the technical writers are given overviews of that functionality, along with answers to questions such as who are the users, what is their environment, what are the results they're expecting from using this software. Your outsourced technical writers could be used exactly to fill in those holes on a regular schedule so that your in-house technical writers can then focus on working on the sprints. But of course, as the experience of Gaile shows, you can have outsourced technical writers working within the sprint. And the key is good communication, and especially good cooperation with QA. I'd like to ask another question. How many of you cooperate closely with QA? And is there anybody who basically doesn't talk to QA at all?
So we have one more answer to the prior thing. Dave Marshall says, yes, it is Swiss cheese. It's constant communication with the product owner. And he also says, yes, we cooperate closely with QA. You know, regarding what you just said, Fred, one of the things that our client has done is to make clear to us that they don't want everything, they don't want all the functionality on the UI documented. They only want the things that are most important to the user, which they have identified and give us guidance in. So that actually is very helpful that they're clear on that prioritization. Let's see, we got some other answers here. QA and UI cooperation, says Martha, yeah. And then we have a question here. What's the point of being in a multifunctional team if you don't collaborate?
Well, this is, okay, well, when we look at where Agile fails, and I actually give a lecture on sabotaging Agile, all the different ways you can mess up Agile. And the number one way is have a lot of meetings, but don't decide anything, right? Just meetings can be the opposite of communication. But when you've got teams that actually do communicate well, as Martha says, where the product owner and the user interface people are in pretty close contact with the technical writers so that there's no surprises, where you've got good communications, most of the process issues can be solved. But where you've got poor communication, it doesn't matter how good your process is, things are still going to be messed up. My follow-up to that is, how early do any of you get the user stories? Are all of you in an agile environment?
I think the question to ask is who's not in an agile environment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dave Marshall says he is. And let's see.
As I think that was Martha suggested, who is not in an agile environment? Because if everyone's in agile, we can focus directly on this.
We got one. Mike is not. I think that's Mike McGraw is not, but Chris is, Martha is, David Marshall is. And Mike McGraw asks, how typical is it for companies to pay attention to what customers want or need in the documentation or perhaps online content? Too often we create documentation that we throw over the fence to our customers. Yeah.
Well, Mike, let me answer that first, and then I'll go on to some agile strategies. If you have online documentation, especially nowadays, where it's going to be web-based, there is always some sort of monitoring going on, looking at who is clicking on what topics. The question is if anyone is paying attention to those logs and if they are making that information available to you and your team. It might be something where you go to your QA colleagues and ask, look, do we actually monitor usage of the online help and have some idea of how many page visits, and we can look at what are the most popular pages, what are the least popular pages, and then do something with that information. But you're right, most companies, honestly, I don't think there's hardly any companies in the technical sphere which were founded by former technical writers. I mean, that's just the reality, right? We're the redheaded stepchildren, so to speak, of the development world sometimes. The last to get the budget, worst equipment, all of these things. But what companies fail to realize until you bring it to their attention in a polite and supportive manner is that the documentation actually serves as one of the faces of the company. And people definitely judge a company on how the quality of the documentation is. You know, whether it's actually useful, whether it's visually appealing or ugly, whether they can find the information they need quickly. And when it comes to adoption rates of new software that doesn't have the fundamental explanations is going to be less likely to succeed in the market. And then finally, if you're talking about if your company is delivering to large customers like the government or very large corporations, most of the time inside the contract for purchase is a requirement for a set level of documentation. This is something that you commonly find in those contracts. The problem is that by the time it gets down to the project managers, product owners, and the people who make the decisions about budgeting and teams, they're frequently lost in the haze of other details. So sometimes it's your responsibility to stand up and say, look, you know, documentation should have X percentage of the budget for any feature based on how much user interaction is involved. And if it doesn't, then, you know, we're just going to get further and further behind, and the reputation of the company suffers.
Well, here's a way that I've found can be effective to get people to see that. If you look across the world broadly, there's a very big problem in the world with companies all over the planet, which is that customer service isn't very good. most people's experience of using customer support, customer service is not that good an experience. And most people now would rather, if they could, find the information they need themselves instead of having to call a help desk. And when they do call the help desk, most of the time they're not satisfied. So some smart companies are starting to realize that if they invest more in their content, in making it higher quality, making it more comprehensive, and making it more findable and accessible, they can both reduce customer support costs and increase customer satisfaction. So,
I could just ask my question one more time. For those of you working in an agile environment, how good is your access to the user stories, and how good are the user stories themselves? I'll shut up now.
Can you say that again?
Say that again, Fred.
How early do you have access to user stories? And what is the quality of the user stories?
Okay, access is good, quality is poor, says Chris. And then we have some more here. We have access to user stories when they're created through TF, typically in the sprint, and quality varies between teams. And let's see, we have another one. We often work in embedded teams, but work on multiple teams. TFS, Team Foundation Server, yes. That's one of our clients uses that, yes. Okay, so when he said that was actually TFS, we have access to user stories when they're created through Team Foundation Server. Okay. Oh, and then another one says, the quality of the user stories are good. Yeah.
Well, that's excellent, because my experience in Agile is that the number one problem for Agile development is poor quality user stories. User stories that don't identify the actor, or else they use a generic as a user instead of specifying what role that user is performing. User stories that are actually non-negotiable and so shouldn't be a user story in the first place. And I think the root of this is that even, I'm a Scrum certified product owner. When I went through the training, they talked about user stories for a total of 10 minutes out of a 2-day training course. And I think actually there's a great need for improving user stories, because if you have good stories, the documentation practically writes itself. If you have poor stories, everybody suffers, okay?
That's exactly what Martha typed. She said, better quality user stories equals easier writing in advance. Poor quality equals got to wait for the review to see it in practice and use. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Martha, you've been there. So let me give you a suggestion for everybody who's working in an agile environment where you're confronted with user stories that are not of the highest quality. You have an opportunity to, it would be totally rude to go to the product owner and say, hey, your user stories suck. You can't do that. But you can go to the product owner and very gently use the 5 W's, okay? The 5 W's from journalism that you all know. And for each of the user stories that you don't understand, ask who. More specifically, not just user or admin, but what kind of user. If possible, if they have any user personas, put a name to the actual user story. And then go on with the 5 W's. Why? What result do they get outside of the system that allows them to have value, right? Because nobody's using computers for computers' sake. And then ask when and where. Is there something that has to precede this? Is this only going to happen in a certain circumstance? Where? Are they using a browser, mobile phone? Is this a dedicated app? What is it, right? And by asking these questions of the product owner outside the daily sprint, don't do this at the daily sprint, but asking these questions of the product owner, you're basically prompting them to give you the information to fill in what is missing in the user story. Because the point of the user story is exactly to talk about these 5 W's so that the developers can concentrate on the how. Because if you have those answers to the 5 W's, you can write all of your introductory text even before the product is developed. And then all you have to fill in at that last minute when they finally stabilize the user interface is the how-to steps and any associated graphics. You've already described, what the thing is, where it is, how it works in general terms before it's even created, when you have that level of understanding from the user story. So if you've got great quality user stories, your life is easy. If you've got poor quality user stories, you can make your life better by early in the sprint asking the product owner these questions. And what you'll find is that the rest of the team is really grateful to get these answers too. Sometimes the developers are a little bit embarrassed asking such basic questions. They think that everybody else knows, right? And as the technical writer, we have the luxury of saying, I don't understand. Tell me more. So if you've got poor quality user stories, try this 5W method of talking to the product owner to get specific answers. And this should help you out. Because again, whether you're outsourcing or not, right? I'm not here to sell you guys outsourcing. I'm here to talk about Agile and documentation. Whether you're outsourcing or not, having those answers early in the process are going to make your life easy. And if you are outsourcing, having those answers early in the process means that even the outsourced remote writers could be writing functionality descriptions for you in advance, so that during the sprint itself, all that's required is to write the how-to steps and run it through QA. So that's one way that outsourcers, when they're skilled like Gaile, and they understand this methodology of asking those 5W questions early, can actually help you get ahead of the sprint schedule, which can be nice, or help you to catch up if you've got a long backlog of delivered functionality that's not documented. And again, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to ask you guys, do you have questions for me? You should ask questions of Gaile. She's doing this in the real world right now. Or perhaps other questions for Barry.
Yeah, let's open it up. Thank you very much, Fred. I think that was very helpful. Let's open it up and see what other questions are out there, and then we'll move on to some closing things. Someone is typing, so we'll have a question here in a minute. Here we go. So David asks, how long have you all worked in an Agile environment? I think, Fred, you've worked the longest in an Agile environment.
Right. So that's a good question because, I think the honest truth is there's never 100% Agile, just like there's never 100% waterfall. So I've been working in growing Agile environments for about 10 years now, where either I've come to an organization and helped to introduce Agile through training and leadership, or where I've come to an organization where they've begun on the path to Agile and I've helped them to improve it. For the last couple of years, I've been mostly working as a consultant rather than as a member of an Agile team. But even in my consulting with my own team, we use Agile methods to plan and prioritize our own work. So the answer is several years.
So in my case, I've been, for the last 6 months, working with one of our customers in an Agile environment. And prior to that, it was about 6 years ago when I last worked in an Agile environment, and that, for less than a year at that point. So I'm really still just starting to learn about Agile and appreciate what it can bring. And the thing I've been pushing before I got so much into Agile was topic-based authoring, which also is revolutionary. And Gail, do you want to answer the question? How long have you worked in an Agile environment?
Oh, hello?
Yep.
Yeah, I think I started working in an agile environment just a few months ago. So
Actually, it was March 15th, Gail.
Oh, yeah, it's March 15th. So this methodology is so new to me.
Very good, thanks.
But it works well.
I can also tell you that I've published articles in magazines such as Software Methods and Tools, talking about improving user stories and processes in an agile environment. So my primary focus actually is on the user stories because everything else flows from that. However, I've been doing technical writing also for almost 3 decades now. So naturally, I emphasize the importance of documentation being a part of the actual agile process. And when I speak at conferences, a lot of the developers are surprised at the emphasis I put on documentation because there are still people who have the mistaken belief that agile means that you don't have to document. And that's absolutely not true. It just means that the documentation occurs at a different time. So you actually have equivalent amounts of documentation being performed as under a waterfall. It's just that you're documenting as you're going rather than trying to define everything up in advance. So the interesting thing, again, is, and I just spoke at the Scrum Global Gathering. I think it was the end of last year or earlier this year. I talked a lot of conferences. And there I was talking with some of the leaders of the Scrum movement, and we're actually talking about how to ensure that both QA and technical writing is given proper recognition and opportunity to contribute to the Agile team. So this is something I'm trying to do on the larger picture, but of course, like everything, it takes time to convince people of our not so sexy work is actually pretty important.
Well, thank you, Fred. And Dave says, thank you, Fred, Barry, and Gail. We have time for one more question, and I've got one for Gail here. Dave says he's been working in Agile for 4 months. Gail, the question is, Gail, do you develop information in topic form or as complete documents?
I think Barry can answer the question for me.
Yes, so we're writing topics, and Gail is writing topics, and pretty much everything we do at Saiff Solutions, whether it's Agile or not, is topic-based.
Right.
Yes, so we write topics. So I'm going to move on to our closing slides. So, this is our standard closing where we let you know that we are a technical writing outsourcing company. We have experience in Agile. We're happy to help. Even if you don't have a need for tech writing for outsourcing right now, or you don't have the budget for it, I'm happy to talk to you and discuss your issues and see if I can be of help in any way. Personally, I have 32 years experience in tech writing and a lot of documentation management experience. And I really enjoy talking to documentation managers, to tech writers, to others involved in technical communications and discussing our problems and how we can solve them. And then one of the benefits of talking to me is if you want to go to LavaCon, it's October 25th through 28th in Las Vegas this year. And we'll be there. We're silver sponsors. and I will be speaking about managing technical writers, and then Mike McGraw, who's in the webinar with us, will have, and he and I are co-leading a 4-hour workshop for documentation managers. And I think it's the first time they're having at LavaCon a workshop that's not just for new doc managers, but for all documentation managers. So if you'd like, and we have a limited number of 70% discounts, which is quite a large discount on the registrations. And if you're interested in that, you can type LavaCon in the question or the chat field, and I'll contact you and we'll discuss it. So thank you very much for joining us. I think this has been a great webinar, and we're going to be sending out in a couple days a link to the slides and some other information. And you know, I'm happy to answer questions, and as are Fred and Gail. So be in touch with us. Thanks very much.
To make one more offer to the listeners. If you go to williamstechnical.com, we have 2 pages full of videos. Most of them are pretty short. There's a couple of them that are a little bit longer. And they talk specifically about technical writing and agile development. And all of those are absolutely free, and I welcome you to have a look at them. Just go to williamstechnical.com, and there's a more videos button to go on and see the archive of, you know, it's dozens of videos there that we've made over the years and put online. So feel free to take advantage of those as a resource. And just as Barry said, if there's any question I can answer, let me know, let Barry know, he'll pass it along to me. And I look forward to perhaps meeting some of you in the near future, and really thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it very much.
And so you see my contact info there on our website, and there's also a different kind of picture of me that you should see on your screen now. That's actually our Ella Bunny, the Saiff Solutions mascot. Thanks very much. Have a great day, everyone.